Welcome into KRNU this Sunday afternoon for special programming. The press conference for Scott Frost's official firing today starts right now. Peyton Thomas alongside Jake Schrantz. We're going to send you to the press conference right now, and we'll be right back with thoughts. So stick with us here on 90.3 KRNU. This is Trev Alberts for the Scott Frost firing press conference starting right now.
For taking on this role. I felt like there's 9 games left in the season. And I think we owed it to the players, we owe it to our fans, to give these players an opportunity these last 9 games. We've got good players on this football team. And so having a different voice and having some new energy and enthusiasm, I'm hoping can make a difference for this team.
That was Trev Alberts at the University of Nebraska Scott Frost firing press conference here on 90.3 KRNU. This special programming, Peyton Thomas, Jake Schrantz. Jake, here we are on a Sunday afternoon. Not the news that I was particularly expecting when I woke up this morning. I remember that moment when you first scroll on your phone and you see that news. I'm not sure who reported it first. I know Ian Rappaport was close. That was the first tweet that I had seen. But wow, what a whirlwind that it has been really for the entire state of Nebraska today in the media.
Yeah, and after last night's game, we kind of expected that would definitely be enough in a loss to Georgia Southern in a shootout like that. That would be enough to eventually kick Scott Frost to the curb in the future, but we weren't sure about waking up this morning to a notification on Twitter of Scott Frost's effective immediate firing before the deadline, I'll say, of October 1st, like we all thought it would. But yeah, very interesting stuff from Athletic Director Trev Alberts, Peyton, and not too much information in terms of what the search is already looking like or what it will look like. Obviously, you want to play that one close to the chest, but I thought a lot of interesting questions were asked and a lot of interesting answers were said.
Well, let's rewind the tape back to last night and put the timing of this decision in context. You come off your second loss of the year, the second time you were favored in a game, and I will say heavily favored in a game, and ended up losing. The one game you did win against North Dakota wasn't ultimately convincing. I think if Nebraska comes out in that North Dakota game and just blows the Fighting Hawks out of the water, we're having a different conversation today about how fluky the Georgia Southern game was. What you saw last night was, yes, some productive things, but major flaws in parts of that game planning and problems that Scott Frost has not been able to fix over his 5 years here.
Yeah, and it was also a lack of leadership. You head into the halftime tunnel competing with a team that was coming in to be, a major underdog in this game this week. And even in a competitive game going into halftime, it almost seemed like no adjustments were made. No one stepped up to lead this team into a better performing second half. And I think the writing was kind of on the wall after that.
Now, today is Sunday, September 11th, one day after the Georgia Southern game. There are 2 more games through October 1st. Now, you have the Oklahoma game next week, and then the break after that, and then the game against Indiana. Now, a lot of Husker fans were looking forward to that Indiana game as one that could have determined Scott Frost's career at Nebraska this season with the buyout clause. Scott Frost's buyout clause at $15 million up until October 1st, and then on that day, it was cut in half to $7.5 million, meaning that if Trev Alberts knew he wanted to make the change after the Georgia Southern game last night, he opted to do it today instead of waiting just 2.5 weeks and being able to save that $7.5 million. And I know that's something that he didn't want to particularly touch on directly in the press conference. He was asked whether there were any boosters involved or any of that sort of matter. Sort of declined comment on that. That's going to be the big question is was Trev Alberts making the right call resource-wise to make this decision now and not sort of, I will say, stick it out until October 1st when that buyout moves?
Well, on that point, I thought it was really interesting the way that somebody, I don't remember who it was, but they asked him about how the resources financially would impact your coaching hiring coming up for next season. And he basically talked about how the resources wouldn't really be an issue when going after a new coach. So even after opting to take the far more expensive route, giving the $15 million that they were originally agreed upon with Scott Frost for him to get out, basically still feeling confident in the financial resources of the university. So you have to basically just give it up to whoever is in charge of that, whether it be the boosters or just the university in general.
That's pretty amazing. When we heard, both of us here in the studio heard that, I know we just kind of looked at each other like, wow. The fact that resources, according to Trev Alberts, would not be an issue. And of course, we're not going to get any specific figures on exactly what that process looked like or what the football programs deal with. But you see all these massive contracts across the college football landscape, and you wonder, all right, how does your program stack up against that? What kind of game are you willing to play with your pockets? And for the Nebraska football program to make that decision today, knowing what they could have saved on that date and what this means today, to give those players an extra couple weeks with the new coach, that's pretty fascinating. And it will become more of a narrative once Nebraska does presumably find that head coaching hire, and then you see the numbers for that contract emerge.
Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable. Trev Alberts talked about how it was most important today he thought he owed it to the players to get a different voice in the locker room and have a different leadership aspect in the locker room as well, with new interim head coach Mickey Joseph. And it's just unreal to think opting to not go for the $7.5 million option later on in the next month. And then also, you have to think with how the state of Nebraska football's program right now, to get a high-level coach in today's college football world where contracts have been inflated mightily, not only are you going to have to pay top dollar for the top coach, but also opting to get that extra $7.5 million to get Scott Frost out early is really unbelievable. And it just goes to show how well off this university is in terms of the football program.
Right. Trev Alberts also had said during the press conference, quote, "We were all in for Scott to be successful." And I think that is somewhat of a good way to capture this era of Nebraska football. When Scott Frost was hired, I think it was unanimously across the state of Nebraska and the Husker fan base as a home run hire. It was a guy who understood why Nebraska was successful in the 90s, understood why this program was so storied in all of the bowl games, and had watched, I will say, its decline between those championships in the mid-90s to when he was hired just a couple years ago. And at that point, I think a lot of Nebraska fans were looking at those 9-3, 8-4 seasons. Yes, you had one or two of those seasons under Riley that went very differently, but that was an outlier in what was otherwise a program that was used to making solid bowl games every year and competing against other Power 5 schools in the postseason. And I think everybody had calibrated their expectations for Scott Frost to be above that. And obviously now you're looking at the program and saying, if you could even get back to that point, to where Nebraska was before the Scott Frost era, that would be an absolute success over the next 3 or 4 years, which is pretty incredible to think about. That shift in mindset and how far Nebraska football has fallen in that way on paper.
Yeah, and that almost all falls on Scott Frost's shoulders, unfortunately. You come in with such high expectations. I mean, he was on a pedestal from what I've heard in the city and when he originally came here, and to see the drop-off, and even just like physically in like pictures, you see like a younger Scott Frost in that first press conference. He looks like a bright young coach, and then you see him yesterday in the press conference after Georgia Southern. You could almost tell on his face he must have known what the result would be today. It looked like a defeated, kind of weathered coach that was ready to move on, and that ends up happening today.
Yeah, Scott Frost personally over these last few years, you saw that change just with his facial expressions, the way he moved on the sideline, the way he interacted with the media in the press conferences, and Nebraska gave him as many shots in this college football landscape where head coaches are fired on a dime, on a trigger. And Clay Helton, who he lost to yesterday, knows that very well. It was amazing that he had gone this long and you saw that much of a change for somebody who came in on that pedestal as the reigning head coach of the year at UCF, a program that he had successfully turned around from a bottom feeder to one of the top teams in the country, not in a Power 5 conference, going undefeated in one of those seasons, coming in, smiling in the press conferences, and you saw some of that confidence early on, and rightfully so, because everything seemed to be going into that line for Nebraska, where you had the right coach, you had the right time, you were getting the recruits, and it is truly amazing that Nebraska has to move on from him here at this point. And I think a lot of the big questions that are asked across Husker fans is, okay, if that didn't work, where are you going to go from here? And I think that's number one reason that there aren't any clear head coaching names that everybody as a consensus like, oh yeah, that's who Nebraska to bring in. And I'm sure Trev Alberts has done a ton of scouting. He already said that the nationwide search was underway. I'm sure that search began a long time ago because they knew that Scott Frost is very capable of losing games like the Georgia Southern game, and if he did that early on in this season, he was going to be gone, right? So they knew that this was a possibility, and they're well underway with that search. But because Scott Frost didn't succeed, despite being from Nebraska, despite playing for this program, that makes that search that much harder to say if he couldn't get it done, who will?
Yeah, and back to your point about Scott Frost lasting so long with how much he's failed in this kind of lose and you're gone format in college football in terms of head coaching jobs. I think a lot of that did have to do with him being like the Nebraska boy, played for the school. A lot of schools like to do that and give the benefit of the doubt to those guys when things aren't going right, especially after Scott Frost kind of had to tear things down a little bit after that first year and said he had to build it up. A lot of toughness had to be built into this program, in his opinion, and apparently that toughness never really was able to be built in through, those few years after that, as he is already gone on September 11th, 2022.
Jake, Trev Albert said during the press conference, quote, "We have an opportunity to have an outstanding coach," when he was, unquote, as he was talking about the national search that starts and begins now, officially begins now in the media. How prestigious is this Nebraska head coaching job right now?
I mean, I would almost have to disagree. I know he had a quote. He said, the right kind of coach sees this as an opportunity, but after watching how much Scott Frost came in with so much potential and praise on that pedestal, I mean, he was one of the top young coaches in the entire country, and he came here. It was really expected that he was going to keep this program competitive and maybe even elevate what it was before he came here. And now, if you're any kind of prospective young coach looking to move into a Power 5 conference and maybe join Nebraska, how do you look at the way things turned out with Scott Frost, who was basically, you're in his shoes just a couple of years after he joined the program, and then you look at him today, he looks beaten and defeated and really heads out with the tail between his legs. And I'm not sure what program is on the phone with him right now asking for him to take their coaching job. So I feel like the young coaches especially may have some trouble looking at this program in terms of national prominence. So I feel like Nebraska may have to look for a coach who's looking for top dollar just to take on this program.
If Nebraska didn't hire Scott Frost, say that the Mike Riley hire had worked out for one or two more seasons, and Scott Frost did move from UCF to a different Power 5 program, I think it would have been really curious to see at that point, as successful as he was at the time in the coaching world, what that could have looked like at a different place, at a different time. Would he have been more successful? And now, where he is now, like you said, you saw the body language change in the press conference. He's a completely different head coach and different person than he was when he was first hired by Nebraska. And now having to put that behind him and move on to somewhere else, it's going to be very interesting to watch. First off, if anybody wants Scott Frost, and then how successful he will be when taking over that new program after he does find a job.
Yeah, I don't know what program. I would imagine it would have to be moving down in terms of maybe a group of 5 school looking to just bring in name relevance. But even doing that, I mean, that's pretty tough to convince your audience and your university that this is the right guy after he took on his own alma mater and basically brought them down to a bottom tier level. But I think we should move on a little bit into the interim hire of Mickey Joseph, because Trev Alberts had a lot to say about Mickey Joseph. He said he believes in him. He thinks that the guys are going to believe in him as well this season. He's going to bring in a new type of leadership to this team. So what are your thoughts on Mickey Joseph coming in over maybe moving up Shenander or Mark Whipple?
Well, I think after last night's game, you can't move up Shenander. Just the PR look of that after his defense was ran over for, I think it was 642 total yards.
Yeah.
That might have been the number. It was over 600. And that was the worst defensive performance as a unit that I've seen from Nebraska in a really long time. And so I don't think you could have done that, even if Trev Alberts wanted to do that. Joseph is an interesting pick, and if you're talking about on the field specifically, it makes Nebraska much more of a wild card. Because all of those players, and Albert's talked about this, he wanted to give the players a chance to win. Well, the players are going to be energized because they recognize that with the new hierarchy, with the new system, there's always places up for grabs. And so everybody on that team is going to play hard to try to earn and redefine their role on Nebraska's team. And will Nebraska be better next week for it? Probably not. In terms of the overall skill, the cohesiveness of the offense and defense, these schemes that have been drilled into this team throughout fall training camp and over the last 2 months, are they more prepared today to face Oklahoma than they were last night? Probably not. But it certainly makes them less predictable, and that could play to their advantage as they start to go into Big Ten play after the Oklahoma game. I think it's still a tough season, and it's going to be a difficult road back for Mickey Joseph. But like Trev Albert said, this is a team that has talent. And if they squeak out a couple of games, if they win some of those one-possession games, I wouldn't be surprised at all. Because a change in personality from the very top in Scott Frost, who built in a culture, as much as nobody wants to admit it, built in a culture of losing one-possession games. I mean, that is a mindset that it was in the back of everybody's heads, that Scott Frost teams lose one-possession games. And whether it's Adrian Martinez or Casey Thompson or whoever has the ball, running back, wide receiver, with a minute to go in the football game, that is in the back of their heads that, oh, I play for a Scott Frost team, and Scott Frost teams do not win these types of games, however much they want to put it away. That I won't say you have a clean slate, but it certainly is a lot easier to beat away that narrative if you know you're playing in a new system and you know you want to prove yourself, and you know that Scott Frost isn't the one that's calling your plays. Well, now you know for sure. Of course, Mark Whipple, everybody has said, is calling the plays so far, but that's not the head man on the sideline that's giving you instructions.
That is an advantage for the interim coach, Mickey Joseph. Doesn't have to call the offensive plays, of course, Mark Whipple doing that job, but I do think it is interesting moving out Scott Frost and bringing in a new coach the week heading into Oklahoma. That, to me, that shows that Trev Albert's, his confidence level going into that game, very low, and maybe looking for an out for that loss, potentially looking at, hey, we had to bring in a coach week of, you can't really blame that on any of our guys. That's a lot of moving pieces to put together in 1 week. But I love your point about less predictability, because over the years, I feel like a lot of these Big Ten teams, especially the Big Ten defenses, kind of learned what a Scott Frost team and a Scott Frost offense would look like. They know how much the quarterback run would be in factor. So I feel like moving in with a new coach mid-season like this, it kind of shifts things up for other teams that have to deal with Nebraska on both sides of the ball, because they've seen Scott Frost for years now. They haven't seen a team led by Mickey Joseph who may kind of energize this team moving forward.
The atmosphere within Memorial Stadium should be absolutely fascinating next week. It's going to be very interesting to see how the fan base tangibly reacts to, I will say, positive plays specifically in the Oklahoma game, when they see Mickey Joseph, when they interact with the players, when Joseph interacts with the media, the nature of those questions. You heard a lot of boos over the last couple weeks in Memorial Stadium. You heard Fire Frost chants at the end and throughout the fourth quarter of the game last night. I don't expect the fan base to be optimistic, but I think the fan base is a little bit relieved. As much as it hurts the pride of a lot of Nebraska fans to finally admit that part of their program's history is over, I think the chance of sort of this new dawn in this unpredictability, this chance to win different games, is going to be very interesting.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll have our final thoughts on the new change for Nebraska football. Head coach Scott Frost no longer the leader for the Huskers. It'll be Mickey Joseph moving forward the rest of the season. This is 90.3 KRNU.
Welcome back into this special program here on 90.3 KRNU, wrapping up the Trev Alberts press conference from this afternoon after the firing of head football coach Scott Frost, Peyton Thomas, alongside Jake Schrantz. Jake, before we send this thing off, I do want to say Mickey Joseph, the first black coach of any sport at the University of Nebraska, a milestone that has been a long time coming for this university. And now Nebraska, the football program, looks ahead to Oklahoma. What are one or two immediate changes that you expect to see either on the field or surrounding it for this football program?
I kind of, especially with it being from Memorial Stadium, I kind of expect the crowd to be maybe a little bit, as you said earlier, relieved, but I think that could end up kind of looking like a more energized crowd as well as an energized team. They're almost a feeling of we have nothing to lose at this point, so I could see a team coming out looking scrappy, trying to represent for their new head coach, Mickey Joseph. It seems like the players really have a good kind of relationship with him, especially as he was just the wide receivers coach, now moving up into a higher role in the program. So I feel like the crowd's going to go with how the team looks on the field. If they're looking energetic, excited for this game, I think the crowd will be right there with them. But if the team kind of looks dreadful and just not really like they want to be out there, I could see the crowd kind of playing off of that.
And lastly, you heard Trev Alberts in the press conference say that he would love to see Mickey Joseph grow into the kind of candidate for the permanent head coaching role. As we've seen interims do in the past across the Big Ten and across college football, if you start performing well, you turn that culture around immediately. Look, he has talented players, and I think that there is sort of this air of, yes, Nebraska is on this nationwide search for a good coach. And if they find the right guy who's willing to take that price, apparently economics are not an issue now for Nebraska. If somebody's willing to come in and do that, they're going to make the hire. But if Mickey Joseph, look, I don't want to be the guy that says Nebraska's going to win eight games this year now at 1-2, but you get a couple of big victories, maybe against Oklahoma, maybe in the Big Ten, you start to see this interim position in a lot different light.
Yeah, I think Mickey Joseph comes into a team this year that really kind of felt stale in terms of the top line. I know there was a lot of coaching moves, but at the top of the program with Scott Frost, it just seemed like it was the same old every single year. Now you move Scott Frost out, you have Mickey Joseph, a new voice, kind of leading the whole program. I feel like Trev Alberts seemed pretty confident in what Mickey Joseph could do for the program. And like you said, I think a couple of potential upset victories. I have to assume, even if Nebraska was the underdog into Oklahoma this week originally, after today, they probably will drop a couple of points in that game. So, I mean, maybe that just fires up this Nebraska team and we get a very shocking ending to a game next week that would fit Nebraska this season. A ton of shocks, but maybe none bigger than an upset win from Memorial against Oklahoma next week.
Say what you want about the Nebraska football program. Predictable is not one of the adjectives that first comes to mind. As this 2022 season rolls on, it will continue to be, at the very least, entertaining to watch as Nebraska football moves further into the future as the Scott Frost era officially comes to a close after the 45-42 loss to Georgia Southern. Trev Alberts, the athletic director here at the University of Nebraska, making the official announcement at this afternoon's press conference. Thanks for tuning in to 90.3 KRNU for this special programming to help digest the changing of the guard at the University of Nebraska for the football program. And we'll keep an eye on Oklahoma this weekend. Make sure to tune back in 90.3 KRNU for an hour before that kickoff for the Husker Countdown pregame show, as well as coverage for next Saturday's game. For Peyton Thomas, Jake Strantz, thank you all for listening.